So let's just pause for a minute. There's a lot written from all sorts of sources on some of the ancient history of the world. I am not pulling from any of those. I'm only going to present what the Law of One says. And so there's probably much more that could be said, but I think what we can look at is what does Ra say as far as their interactions with ancient ancestors, what happened to them, things like that. So we'll explore just from the Law of One's perspective, these significant groups that sort of come up as truly ancient history because they're going back, um, in some cases, more than 50,000 years. And Ra tries to give some time frames in here. I can't vouch, nobody can really because nobody's alive that was there, but for the estimate of time frames, but I do say that Ra tries to be as accurate as they can and sometimes makes mistakes with time frames by usually by saying things like million years instead of billions or mistakes like that. I don't think he's making mistakes in these ones, but because usually he'll go back and correct them later. And as far as I know, the dates on these, he hasn't tried to correct, but he's doing estimates, if you like. So if he says 53,000 years, it might be 52,821 or something. If you want to be down to the last uh, year, he's just sort of rounding up. So let's just sort of go through it. It kind of goes through, starts with where it all started, which is actually Maldic. And this was considerably long, long, long ago. So in a galaxy not so far away, but a long, long time ago, there's something that happened that still has influence and impact on us. So this is our solar system in the picture, and the great mass of little dots around the circle between Mars and Jupiter is the asteroid belt that was a planet called Maldic. And it was inhabited, and it was destroyed by warfare. And this is what Ra says regarding this. So what happened to, again, I encourage questions as we go through. They really keep it interesting and they keep it present in what people are thinking and help the presentation. Actually, the discussion is much more important than just downloading information to you guys. So we're all friends here. We'll ask whatever questions come up and we'll just sort of go through it that way. So I'll read the question with you. Again, Don's asking what happened to Maldic or the people of Maldic to cause them to lose their planet. How long ago did this occur? So Ras says the people of Maldic had a civilization somewhat similar to that of the societal complex known to you as Atlantis. And now he's going to describe how Maldic was similar to Atlantis. But it's interesting. He starts talking to Maldic by comparing it to what was going on in Atlantis on Earth many hundreds of thousands of years later. So as Atlantis, in that it gained, Maldic and Atlantis gained much technological information and used it without care for the preservation of their sphere, their Earth, their planet, following to a major extent the complex of thought, ideas, and actions which you may associate with so-called negative polarity or the service to self. So that's Ra speak for saying that they used their technology, they advanced quickly in technology to a high degree and used it for negative reasons to manipulate, control, or enslave others on the planet or others with that technology. So they used it in that way. It's implied that that's also what happened in Atlantis. And when we get to the Atlantis sections later in the presentation, Ra confirms that. So they fell into the same trap of using their high technology to promote negative polarity, service to self kind of agendas, which are always dominance, enslavement, separation, elitists dominating the rest, etc. This was, however, for the most part, couched in a sincere belief or thought structured, in a sincere belief or thought structure, which seemed to the perception of the mind body spirit complex of the sphere to be positive and of service to others. Again, Ra speak. If I reread it and just sort of say it in our language, the most people on the planet had a belief that what was going on, their perception of what was going on, the people of the planet was that it was going to be a positive and in service to others. So, however they justified or sold going to war with whoever they went to war with, it was supposed to be to do good. And we've seen that in modern times over and over and over again. So they believed, for the most part, the people of Maldek, that what they were doing was supposed to be of service to others. In reality, it was service to self. Often that's the case with wars in our society. Obviously, there's a long-standing history of that in the universe. The devastation that wrecked their biosphere and caused its disintegration resulted from what you call war. So just the results of that was a non-inhabitable planet. The escalation went to the furthest extent of the technology that social complex, that group had at its disposal in the time frame present to them then. And this was 705,000 years ago, a long time ago in a galaxy not too far away, our own galaxy, our own solar system, actually. So about 705,000 years ago, Maldek blew itself up. So they used the technology to the fullest extent. We'll find out later it was nuclear, as well as other advanced weapons that we, as far as we know, don't have yet, or at least aren't revealed yet. But they had definitely nuclear, and however else they did it, this is what happened to their planet. It's now just a bunch of pebbles around. This time was 705,000 of your years ago. The cycle had begun much, much earlier. The cycle meaning the cycle of third density life on that planet Maldek had begun much, much earlier upon the sphere due to the relative ability to support the first dimensional life form. So when he's saying the cycle, he's actually saying life started on Maldek many, 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 probably billions of years before, because that was a planet in our solar system that was able to produce or support first and second density life much earlier than perhaps Earth was. That's what he's sort of meaning here. So the cycles, and he says cycles plural, had begun much, much earlier upon the sphere due to its relative ability to support first dimensional life forms at any earlier point in the space-time continuum of the solar system. So basically one of the first ones. These entities were so traumatized, these third density entities, the people who blew themselves up, many of whom thought they were doing a good thing, but were deceived by their leaders. These entities were so traumatized by the occurrence that they were in what you may call a social complex knot or tangle of fear. And they stayed like that for thousands of years. Okay. And in other discussions that we can do, and I want to do a whole presentation on Maldek and Mars and their influence on us, that I was going to integrate to this one, but it became too much. So maybe we'll do that next time. We find out that they were unreachable for a long time. Some of your time passed. No one, oh, it says it here, no one could reach them. No beings could aid them because they were just so locked in a tangle of fear based upon what had happened, which basically they'd done to themselves. So that's kind of setting a stage for how Ra and the Confederation, Ra says it exists, it comprises 7 different solar systems. They call them galaxies, but Ra uses the term galaxies much more loosely than we do. Galaxies to us is like Milky Way, Andromeda, etc., different galaxies that are whole spiral clusters of billions of suns. Ra uses it that way in some terms, and other terms, it's basically a solar system, often though with more than one sun. He says there are seven specific um, galaxies or solar systems that comprise the confederation that we belong to, which is the one that set up the quarantine that is governed by the council at Saturn. Okay. And so they view our solar system through the lens of what happened in Maldek. And then what was repeated almost exactly the same way, not quite as bad, to Mars. So this sort of paints the picture of how they're approaching Earth and the early civilizations on Earth. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's start off then looking through kind of some of the ancient civilizations on Earth. Now moving forward to our 75,000 year from now back time frame, because we're right at the end of that cycle. Remember, they talk about it in three 25,000 year cycles. So it was the first cycle of 25,000 years and what happened there. Then there was a second one, and now we're in the third one. Our history, our so-called scientific narrative of human history goes back only about 10 to 12,000 years, thinking that that's when civilization evolved. And before that, people were nomads and cave dwellers and basically very primitive humans for however long back then. But there was nothing substantial as far as technology or even lifestyles. They were very much small groups of nomadic and cave dwelling type of people. That is not the narrative that Ra's giving. And that is not really the truth. Many of us, and you are aware of what they call um, out of place findings of geological findings that just don't fit. And there's so much evidence of that their narrative is really falling apart. But that's the story they're telling. That is only the last little piece of our third section. And so they're saying civilization has been here from the beginning, 75,000 years of civilized, even some advanced technological groups that went through the cycles. And what happens apparently at the end of each cycle, there's usually some kind of major catastrophic shift in the earth that tends to wipe out past civilizations, and we'll talk some about that. And some of them happen even in a smaller amount between halfway between the 25,000 year cycle. So there was one about 12,000 years ago, right as we started coming out of the last ice age. That was another one that's sort of associated with Noah's flood, and Ra will talk about that in a minute too. So let's get into the Mu people. It is possible, the way that Ra talks about this, that the Mu people divided into a number of different groups and actually are also the Lemurians. But we'll look at that because it's not strikingly clear that they're the same, but it implies that they are. So Don asks, I was wondering about the event of a civilization called Atlantis and Lemuria, the way these civilizations occurred and where did they come from? The civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria were not one but two. Let's look at the Mu entities first, basically. They were beings of somewhat primitive nature, and he's saying that from a technological point of view, but those who had very advanced spiritual distortions. So they lived in a kind of very simplistic lifetime, but very spiritual people. Kind of maybe similar to the ancient American Indians. The civilization was part of this cycle, and that's deceiving because that doesn't mean this 25,000 years. It means this Earth cycle, the whole 75,000 year piece, experienced early within the cycle at a time of 53,000 of your years ago, which is about 51,000 BC, right? if you do a bit of the math on that. So these are these are the oldest group that Ra talks about. So they were around right in the first cycle, basically. And we're in the transition from the first 25,000 year cycle as a transition to the second one, where it goes into the 26 up through 50, right? A long time before our history even kicks in from modern understanding of world history. It was a helpful and harmless place. So that's the nature of the people's disposition, which was washed beneath the ocean during a readjustment of your sphere's tectonic plates through no action of their own. In other words, there was a disaster that caused a great flood back then that wiped out that civilization in a sense, not because they were doing anything wrong, which was what's implied in this second great flood with Atlantis and Noah and all them. This was just due to the shifting of tectonic plates. That's kind of an unfortunate thing to happen to them. However, they didn't all get destroyed in that. He says they set out, meaning the Mu people, those who survived and reached many places in what you would call Russia, North America, and South America. Later on, they also say China was early advanced technologically and were from the Mu people, or from the people that came from the same Deneb galaxy, which is shown here, that the Mu people came from. So let's just get to that. So they ended up in Russia, North America, and South America. The Indians, of whom you have come to feel some sympathy, meaning the American Indians, South American as well as North American, and your social complex distortions, are the descendants of these entities. So the American Indians is a good way to look at how the Mu people probably were, because a lot of what they inherited were traditions from these ancient peoples. Like the other incarnates of this cycle, the other people on the planet at that time, they came from elsewhere. They weren't native evolutionary human beings in a sense. They were transplants that were reincarnated, likely as they do. And Ra makes it clear that this is a common practice. But it's happened a bit more on Earth than in many other normal planets. We're a little bit of an anomaly that way, in that we have a number of different transplants from a number of different places, including Maldek and Mars, but also this group from Mu, the Mu people from Deneb. Okay, so they came from elsewhere. However, these particular entities were largely drawn from a second density planet, which had some difficulty due to the age of its sun in achieving third density life conditions. So they had evolved up to third density abilities in Deneb, on one of these planets here, but didn't stay there because the planet itself was not going to be able to support third density light. The sun was going into probably a red giant or supernova or whatever it was doing. It was an older sun, so it wasn't able to support it. That's sort of kind of what Ra is saying there. This planet was from the galaxy Deneb, galaxy or solar system is a better way to interpret it, but again, he uses the word galaxy kind of loosely. So that's sort of the history of where Mu people came from. Deneb, 51,000 BC, so 43,000 years ago, probably one of the oldest civilizations that Ra himself dates and talks about, that ended up in Russia, North America, South America, and later he talks about them going to China. Questions about that? We don't have a lot on Mu specifically, other than it's a helpful, harmless place, fairly low in or primitive in technology, but advanced in spiritual distortions. They had a real inclination towards more spiritual things. Again, the American Indian is a great example of that. Anyway, any questions on that?
Yeah, I have a question actually about the Native American Indians. Would that suggest that anyone that has had an incarnation as a Native American Indian would have come from that original lineage?
It would be a likelihood, but not necessarily everyone. No, not necessarily everyone that was ever in a reincarnation as a Native American was, but it's very likely. At least that group started out that way. Others might have reincarnated into American Indian families from a number of different other places, depending upon what their soul wanted. But certainly, that culture inherited from this galaxy to Nab, the Mu people's kind of harmless, helpful spiritual distortions that would have rubbed off on those who reincarnated with them. So I think as a base, the beginning it was like that. I don't know how much that continued because in the reincarnation cycle, sometimes people don't continue to reincarnate with their own kind. Many want to, but some want to try something new. So there might be some of that. So I don't think it's definitive, but most likely, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So let's get to Lemuria. Okay, so as we progress into the second 25,000 year cycle, at that time, during this period, was this the period of Lemuria? He's saying, no, not really. Those who escaped the destruction of Lemuria by natural catastrophe and were thus of Lemuria background continued their learning, teaching, their experience as mortals at locations ranging from South America onward through the Americas as you know them, and continued over what was at that time a bridge which no longer exists, and I was going to Russia. There were those in what you would call Russia. So he's saying the Lemurians did exactly the same things what he said before the Mews did. Now remember, the Mew one was several sessions before. The Mew one was in 10th session. This is in the 21st session. So it's been some time past since he said that. But he's referring back to Lemuria, just like he is saying basically the same things that as he did with the Mew people. So there's the correlation there. They went to the same places, etc., after they survived the flood catastrophe that happened around the 26,000 year changeover. So Don then asked, so these are going to go through, we're going to go through 21 for several pages. Just to quickly refresh my mind, how many years ago did Lemuria suffer its catastrophe? This was approximately 50,000 of your years ago, about 48,000 BC. So Lemuria or the Mews lived for quite a while, and right around 48,000 BC, that's when the transition from the first 25,000 year period changed to the second one. And there was a graduation then. Remember, every 25,000 years, there's a harvest or graduation opportunity. That's the cycle that the eternities work on. That's happened on every planet that has third density, as far as Raj mentioned. That happened on us. So we've already gone through two possible harvests or ascension opportunities. In the first one, we learned that nobody graduated. So these were the people that were around then. The origins being approximately 53,000 of years ago, the damage being completed in that last small cycle of the first major cycle. So the last small cycle, the last sort of ending of the first 25,000 years. Don says, well, thank you. Then did the ending of the first major cycle have something to do with the destruction of Lemuria? Or did this destruction just happen to occur at the end of that cycle? Ras says, there is a confluence of energies at the ending of a major cycle. That is what we're experiencing now, my friends. This same, and it's a bigger one than ever, because the third cycle ending is the big ending. That's the climax ending. So what happened to them was a confluence of energies at each major cycle. Now it's like a major confluence of energies. And the beauty of it is that I just listened to a great Cryon prophecy for about 10 minutes today. He talks about how the energy is shifted in the human psyche to create an opening, an opportunity that is very, very good for us. So we're doing the right things in groups like this and others around the world, where people are waking up enough that these kind of disastrous world-changing events are mitigated significantly. Doesn't mean they're not going to happen at all, but they're mitigated significantly. Okay, so there is a confluence of energies at the end of a major cycle. That's just normal. This encouraged what was already an inevitable adjustment in the movement of the surfaces of your planetary sphere. So the tectonic plates moving. So the confluence of energies just made that sort of tipping point happen. And so that, in other words, he's saying yes, the changeover from the 25 to the 26, 27,000 years ago, a first cycle over 50,000 years ago, was not coincidental. It happened. That's when Lemuria was destroyed by that flood. And that's also what happened because of the energy shifts. Okay. Questions about Lemuria? Do you see the crossover between Lemuria and Mu? I think it's really, and Ra doesn't say it, but he's implied quite strongly that Lemuria is the name for what evolved after that as a civilization that is often compared with Atlantis, but they actually were separated by a considerable amount of thousands of years, it appears. But whereas the Mu people kind of evolved into the Lemurians. Yeah. Okay. So then he goes on, well, what else happened? And here's where we hear about the Chinese. Then in this second 25,000 years, again, 50,000 years ago from us, major cycle, was there any great civilizations that developed? In the sense of greatness of technology, there were no great societies during this cycle. So that's in the second one. So that's 25 to 50,000 years ago. During that process, he's saying there wasn't so much. There was some advancement among those of Denab who had, and this is where he's connecting it to China again, to Denab, that same place the Mu people came from, who had chosen to incarnate as a body. So they came together as a group in what you would call China. So interesting. He's implying that ancient China, a lot of the people from Denab said, yeah, let's all go there. Let's all go in the same place. So many, what it sounds like is the ancient parts, the first 20 and the second 25,000 year period, the governing body that the Confederation was part of kind of placed different soul groups that came from these different places together into communities like China, wherever the Mu people first were, and they kind of stayed intact in their group. And it seemed like they had a kind of a bunch, they called them experiments, where they had different groupings separated by geography, where they didn't really know about each other. And it enabled them to kind of work with their group, if you like, the groups that they were kind of supporting as a higher level entity, like the Egyptians and the South Americans, to help them in their spiritual kind of quest for enlightenment. So there wasn't a lot of crossover travel or integration between these cultural societies. Obviously, technology enables that. When they didn't have the technology, that wasn't likely. So those who from Denab came to and inhabited or were reincarnated in China. There were approximately positive steps in activating the green ray energy complex in many portions of your planetary sphere, including the Americas, the continent which you call Africa, the island which you call Australia, and that which you know as India, as well as various scattered peoples. Again, this is in the second 25,000 year period. So that's a good sign. People started to wake up. The green ray center started to live more in a heart-centered, out of love. That's where the real choices of service to self and service to others kick in. So that started to happen. That was a positive sign. None of these became what you would call, what you would name great, as the greatness of Lemuria or Atlantis is known. So he identifies these two as emerging societies that are known today that were great societies, that are known to you due to the formation of strong social complexes and, in the case of Atlantis, very great technological understanding. So Atlantis had the technology and developed it. Lemuria, not so much. They stayed quite primitive from a technological point of view, but advanced spiritually. Okay, So there's a difference there that he's teasing apart. In the case of Atlantis, very great technology understandings. However, in the South American area, again, where the Mu people went, of your planetary sphere as you know it, there grew to be a great vibratory distortion towards love, saying again what he's saying up here about the green rays being activated. These entities were harvested at the end of the second major cycle without ever having formed strong social or technological complexes. So the ruins here representing that, they were able to get to a point where they were harvestable. Apparently, it was still a small group, but that was the first success on planet Earth of people graduating the class, if you like, and before then, and that took the first 50,000 years. In other places, Rara said that in most planets, there's a small group that usually graduates at the end of the first 25, a bigger group at the end of the second 50,000, and a major group at the end of the third. Our planet has thrown that off a little bit because of other anomalies, which has created some concern, which has done things which we talked about last time, where they have put us in a quarantine and have done this alternative kind of timeline that has impacted us in hopefully a positive way. So all of this is context for kind of how they're overseeing our spiritual education, maybe is a good way to put it. They meaning the Council of Saturn and the Confederation of which we are a part of and which protects us. Questions about this a little bit. We're going to go a lot more detail into Atlantis. There's not a lot more on Lemuria, but there's a lot more on Atlantis.
I'm just trying to locate this ancient history in us history itself. So it seems like in every cycle, these civilizations had evolved and they have changed at the point of harvesting or for any other reasons transform or destroyed. But I can see that clearly in the first, second, and now we're on the third, except for the ancient civilizations in South America, which evolved spiritually. I don't know if that was faster, but they were harvested earlier. But I can see the civilizations identified somehow in each one of the 3 cycles for the 75,000 years. Is that more or less correct, how the history goes?
Yeah, some of them, essentially, yes. There was always survivors for each of these devastating events that happened on the 25,000 year, 50,000 year changeover, and some of the ones that happened in between that carry on the stories and some of the traditions. But a lot of what they had as far as their technology and everything else in their society was lost, usually beneath the sea, except for their major work with stonework. And so all we have left is great edifices of stone that we're still trying to figure out how the hell did they build that because of the giant size and weight of these the stonework. So they had a technology that worked with using these stone structures in a way that we still have yet to discover or use that was well known amongst a lot of the different ancient civilizations. That's the only kind of evidence that seems to be left from the earth-shaking destructions that seem to happen just typically as the energy changes at each cycle. The energy changes because the earth itself as a living being is evolving. And so as she's growing in her capacity to support life and her energies herself, it creates some changes in her outward configuration, if you like, her mantle, which is quite devastating to those on it. And there's many, many stories of this, the Noah flood and all the stories of other civilizations around that but that wasn't the first time that it happened. Apparently, first time it happened was right at the 25,000 year. Very first one was over 50,000 years ago, or at least the first one talked about in the Law of One. And so it's not an uncommon event to have during these transitions quite a significant upheaval, which throws a lot of civilizations into disarray, and they kind of have to start over. And that's what they're saying happened. The Mu people went to a number of different places, including South America, brought a lot of their understanding with them if enough of them survived, and rebuilt in a sense. And that's what we have left over today. Again, we're looking back in time much, much further than modern day archaeological people think we can look to find civilized, technologically advanced people. They think after at least, no more than 20,000 years from now, everybody was cavemen, basically, which is just an inaccurate story. But that's the story that the mainstream storytellers of our scientists today are holding to. Ra's giving you a different story. Yeah. I understand from previous material. So here we're going to go through kind of a when did Ra and the Confederation come and help people, and how did they do it? For the whole 75,000 years, when were there significant times that Ra came down and helped? And in helping, it's essentially the same help, giving the Law of One, because that is the truthful teachings of what's going on in the universe, and how what your life is doing here on Earth is manifest in that, or interacts with that. And so all the ancient religions and all the ancient traditions are usually a distorted version of the Law of One in one sense or another, depending on how badly distorted they got. So he starts by asking that question. I understand from previous materials this meaning the appearance of humans. This occurred 75,000 years ago. So that's when the evolutionary shift on the planet happened from second to third density planet. Before that, it was only animals and plants, and it was that way for a number of billions of years. Then it was our third density process of evolution began. So again, that's what he's saying here. Can you tell me the history, hitting only the points of development, shall I say, that occurred during this 75,000 years? Any particular times or points where the attempts were made to increase the development of this third density? So he's saying, when were people open to receiving inspiration, instruction, teachings to help them advance spiritually and learn the lessons of third density during this whole 75,000 year cycle? So Ra says the first attempt, so he's looking at the whole of Earth human history. The first attempt to aid your peoples was at that time 75,000 years. The next attempt was approximate. So when humans first were implanted or transplanted here and evolved in here, right at the beginning, they gave them some aspects of the Law of One to help them. Okay, they just didn't drop them off and say, "In for yourselves, you're on your own." That's not the way that it's set up. The universe is much more loving than that. You don't send your kids off to boarding school and say, "Don't call us, we'll call you. I hope you got a sharp pencil, and try and wash your clothes once in a while." You give them a little more help than that if you truly want them to succeed, and that's kind of what he's saying here. So the first time when they first started to evolve into humans, and when the humans were put down here, they gave them information. The next attempt was approximately 58,000 of your years ago, continuing for a long period in your measurement with those of Mu, as you call this race and mind, body, spirit complex, these peoples. The next attempt was long in coming and occurred approximately 13,000 of your years ago, when some intelligent information was offered to those of Atlantis. So Ra did help the Atlanteans. This, and we'll get into more detail as what that was about as we go on, this being of the same type of healing and crystal working of which we have spoken previously. So that's what they were teaching the Atlanteans. The next attempt, 11,000 of you years ago, these are approximations, as we are not totally able to process your space-time continuum measurement system. It's interesting that they say that. See, they've been very clear and honest. They're giving approximations of the times, but people say, well, if these guys are outside of our time space, why can't they just look and see? And one of the problems is that, remember, we're on this alternate timeline that goes parallel with the main timeline, and that creates some confusion in some of these calculations and some difficulty there, I believe. And so they're being very honest about that. They're not saying, don't hold us to these exact times, but they're pretty accurate. These are approximate. I'll tell you what he said there. This was 11,000 years ago. This was with your people called Egypt. This was in what you call Egypt. And of this we have also spoken. So they helped the Egyptians. We've known that. That's where they got the term. Ra actually was famously made, that well known from Egypt. Okay. The same beings which came with us returned approximately 3,500 years later. That would have been about 5,500 BC, returned in order to attempt to aid the South Americans. So they went to Egypt 11,000 years ago, then returned 5,500 years ago to the South Americans. The same ones that helped Egypt helped the ones in South America. Mind, body, spirit complex, or peoples, once again. However, the pyramids of those so-called cities were not to be used in the appropriate fashion. Doesn't go into that. They weren't used in the same way that maybe they were supposed to be used in Egypt. Partly, I think, just you can piece that together in your own mind. The Egyptian pyramid was clearly designed as a healing and ascension device, primarily. It had other uses as well, balancing the energy grid of the earth, etc. Apparently, that's not the way that they built the pyramids in South America, that they considered appropriate fashion. He goes on, therefore, this was not pursued further. Because of that, they didn't teach them further those kind of uses. There was a landing approximately 3,000 of you years ago, also in South America, as you call it. So the landing implies a physical appearance and walking among them. There were a few attempts to aid your peoples approximately 23,000 years ago, 2,300, sorry, 1,000 years ago. This was again in Egypt. The remaining part of the cycle, we have never been gone from your fifth dimension and have been working in this last minor cycle to prepare for harvest. So they're saying we've always been with you. And we'll find out later that the caveat is we need to call them in to help us. They stand ready to help, but they are bound by honoring our free will and can't help us if we don't have a call strong enough to enable them to come and answer. That's one of the primal laws that the Confederation works with. Don asks, was the Egyptian visit of 11,000 years ago the only one where you actually walked on the earth? Ra says, we are the vibration sound complex Ra. We have walked among you only at that time. So they did come and actually dwell with the Egyptians for a time, walking among them, and were recognized as divine entities or aliens, if you like, or beings from another sphere or world. And so that sort of frames some of the leftover historical fables, if you like, about what happened in Egypt. So there was a time when they walked freely amongst the people and taught them. But we know from another place that they quickly distorted their teachings, which were the law of one, and so they left. And that their presence there was more damaging than helpful. And they talk about how they were naive in thinking that they could help by doing that. And so they don't do that anymore. And in fact, we'll learn in a little while that their main way of helping is exactly how they helped in 1981. They do channeling. They allow that's about the only way they find is the most effective way to transmute information that's helpful. Appearing seems to do more damage than help.
So my question is, it came earlier also in my mind long ago. So as Scott, you are mentioning that all we have to ask. This is something we have been asking many times. We have been discussing. So whenever, is it like asking one blanket for all other things, or like for every single time, every single day?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not so much that you say, I would like the Confederation to come and teach me something about XYZ. And
Yeah.
then that's it. It's more of a calling from the vibration of your heart, where you desire to know how do I influence the world population to be more peaceful and benevolent, just to give up war and hate, and how do I upgrade my own vibration? How do I approach being able to work through the veil, having that desire, and we'll learn quite quickly, and coming into a community that shares that desire. So that's a resonance that you would hold as part of your natural beingness, that seekingness, rather than what you're saying verbally once or twice or even every day. If you do it, people can say things like that every day as a ritual, but not really have the vibration that supports it. It's that
Right.
vibration that calls them. Yeah.
So again, here exactly like by this stage, I think we all are deeply committed 24 all time with that surrender state and seeking the guidance sake, as well as looking for that guidance, and we are trying to rely, connect.
Yeah.
So it's like we fully committed, right? There's nothing else left for us.
Well, no, there is to continue to persevere, because what we want to do is influence others to transition from being um, confused, scattered, angry, frustrated, whatever they're pursuing, that's taking them into distractions that aren't in their best interest. And a lot of people on earth are still doing that. We want to kind of move more and more of them into the camp of alignment. That's what's needed to reach the tipping point. And so our influence in holding that and continuing to hold it and press it is like a magnet that's drawing more and more to it. And it's just a matter of time. And what Brian was saying today in the prophecy thing is that that there's some significant changes in the energy of the planet, because we've gotten to a point where there's enough. And Ra will say in a few minutes that the calling has to come by the law of squares. And I don't want to go into the math of that, but it's basically like if you have 100 people calling, it's like 1,000, 1,200, something like that. It's to say it's the equivalent of 1,200 people if 1,200 people were calling, because as more and more come together with the calling the same, it multiplies itself. And so 1,000 people, and we learned this through what Judy's involvement was when they did the meditation and influenced the energies of the world for a while, when they did that focused meditation. That's by the law of squares. You get a small group of people that have this calling, it is multiplied as if it's a much bigger group. And that calling of the small group has to overbalance or outbalance the general confused calling of all the rest. You see that? That's where it balances out, because they're all calling for all these different confusing things that are all distorted and not in harmony. And that's why when Ra says it's like we struggle to grasp the needle that points to the north, because we're all going in different directions. It's like we're all in a big boat, and half the people are facing the wrong way and rowing only on one side, and the boat's just going around in circles. We've got to get enough people rowing harmoniously together to start creating momentum for the ship that we call humanity. I don't know if I answered your question though.
Yeah, 100% it's clear.
Okay.
And just now in between, just a thought came. It's so important given this, the law of square you're saying, and exactly, I remember Judy has mentioned that many times. Like, we have this, not as a ritual, but bedtime prayers, because generally nighttime there's a particular period people are going to sleep. I'm just thinking like how it starts like from a childhood, and similarly in the morning, first thing in the morning. So let's say people are waking up in a particular time period, and they have this ritual. The first thing, getting up, having this meditation or prayer sort of. It's just a thought came suddenly.
Yeah.
So that's a good
And some of those
like
ritualistic habits are good. The
yeah.
problem is that a lot of times we do it as a ritualistic habit and our heart is not in it. So that's not very strong calling. There needs to be a heart-centered to it. So as we learn that, you
Yeah.
learn to center yourself in your feeling intent and intend that, which links up with a lot of things we've heard about. That's the key to how the rainmakers make rain come. The
Yeah.
great story of that is that the guy that did that in the story I heard, he imagined himself standing in a downpouring of rain in the mud between his toes, and as he sort of was chanting and thinking, he was putting himself right there as if the rain was pouring on him, and he held that feeling for a several minutes, and that was the calling. See, that's the same kind of thing as to hold that feeling of desire to serve others, desire to resonate with the universe in harmony, desire to bring up our brothers and sisters out of their confusion and help them awaken into their own insights. That desire is the calling.
Superb. Thank you so much.
In the quote, "We have never been gone from your fifth dimension," end quote. What does that mean? Does it mean that we were on the fifth dimension and somehow stepped down? Or does it mean that the fifth dimension already exists for us on a parallel universe? Or what is this? What is the exact meaning of from your fifth dimension? Your fifth dimension.
It's a good question, and I can only give my opinion. I think implied by that is, as Ra is referring to, the dimension that they exist in would be considered close to our fifth dimension in reference to how they interact with us, rather than coming and appearing in our third dimension or third density. They work through us in the spiritual means through what he's referring to as the fifth dimension. Whether that's the same as what is traditionally known as the 5D, 6D, 12, all the dimensions that are talked about in the popular material, I can't say. It could be. It doesn't. There's nothing that negates that it would be. But I think what he's saying is we exist in this dimension, and from out of that, we reach out to you while you're in 3D. That's how I see it.
Wonderful.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat. So they're happy for us to be injected with nanotech to become batteries and used as slaves to a control group. Why is that not enough to intervene?
I don't think they're happy about that at all. But there's the flow of intervening into the agency of others is directly forbidden from the Confederation point of view. The ones that intervene into agency is the Orion group that impose their will on others no matter what they want. And that's an Orion group agenda. They allow that to be balanced by their calling. If there's enough people on Earth that want and that are tricked into going along with it, then we have allowed it ourselves as a collective. Enough people, as we saw, were duped by the common teachings around the world that this was necessary and you're actually being selfish if you didn't go along with the group. There was enough people that allowed themselves to be pulled into that illusion and voluntarily went along with it, that Ra and the Confederation couldn't say, no, don't do that. Now, the one place that I think that they would is if we were about to nuke ourselves again, because they don't want a repeat of Maldek or Mars on Earth. And there is a risk to that because we have the technology at that level now. So they haven't said that directly, but it's implied that they're very careful about not sort of about watching that we don't go over that tipping point, because they've seen it happen twice in this solar system. They don't want a third occurrence of that. And so who knows if we got to that point, what would happen? That could be a rather spectacular event. They might allow it to happen on a limited basis. I don't know. They won't speak on when they will intervene, but generally they will not. They will not counteract our free choice. And if enough people wanted to take the vax, they'll take it. And the Confederation listen. See, to them, death is not really an ending at all. It's just a transition into the learning. It's like a break between semesters in university. You come out of the classroom environment and you start to sit back and go, I wish I'd have studied harder on that topic. And next semester, I think I'll take that topic. You kind of regroup yourself. That's what happens between lives. So them, death is just a normal part of the process. So if people choose to do something that's going to cause a mass transition into the next realm, a spiritual realm, that's by their choice. And that's part of the lessons they're learning in the educational process, is to make choices and then to live with the consequences. So let's start looking at Atlantis in some detail and get into some of what's happened with them since Atlantis. There's a lot of myths and things and stories around it, and a lot of people feel connected to Atlantis. And so let's look what Ra actually says happened there and what it was like there. Don asked, well then, as the cycle terminated 25,000 years ago, so that was at the end of the second cycle, what was the reaction of the Confederation to the lack of harvest? So he's asking that because only a small group was harvested, remember, and that was from South America. It was about 150 odd people, which was, what Ross says here, we became concerned. That's pretty powerful for them to say that. We, as the Confederation that govern this solar system and others, saw that, and that troubled us, is what I read there. They did not think that was a good sign at all. Was any action taken immediately, or did you wait for the call? The Council of Saturn, so that's the 9 that sit as council leaders over the Confederation, and they call it the Council of Saturn because they physically seem to be located within the rings of Saturn from our perspective, acted only in allowing the entry into third density of other mind, body, spirit complexes, which is people or individual souls, if you like, of third density, not wanderers, but those who sought further third density experience. So these were third density people were put in here. So it was kind of like a transplanting of people, if you like, trying to sort of, boost the vibratory inertia of the human family. This was done randomly so that free will would not be violated, for there was not yet a call. So that's all they could do at that point, because there wasn't a call. See, the call opens the door. Very interesting the way that implied in these messages, you're getting a sense for how the governing body of eternity works. What is important to them? The law of free will is sacred and sacrosanct to them. It's not just something they put out there until people make choices and then they jump in and go, no, you're screwing it up, you guys. No, they let it play out. It's very important to them that they do that. And that's another example of that. Don then asks, was the next action taken by the Confederation when a call occurred? That's correct, Ras says. Who or what group produced this call, and what action was taken by the Confederation? The call was that of Atlanteans. This call was for what you would call understanding that the distortion towards helping others selves. So there were enough Atlanteans that wanted to know, how can we help us get better together, kind of thing. There was enough people that wanted that it created a calling. The action taken is that which you take part in at this time, the impression of information through channels, as you would call it. So The call was made. Ra was able to channel Lord One information through somebody in Atlantis, or maybe more than one. Again, they had to wait to be asked before they intervened. They're very important to understand that there is an order to it, and that they hold themselves to these laws or these principles very dearly. They hold that very, because it's kind of the way I look at it is, if you send your kids off to university to learn and you see them not doing well and failing and messing around and just blowing it, having parties and that, not really learning anything properly, just wasting their time. At what point do you jump in and say, look, I'm going to go to classes with you and sit by you and make sure you take notes and study? Or do you say, well, they'll learn the lesson of failure from this? And these are very wise beings, and they know that to intervene is to actually make it worse. So they have to let it play out, but they sit there and watch like you would if you were watching your children screw something up and go, holy crap, I don't like where this is going, but let's see if it wakes them up. Maybe it'll wake them up. It'd be like watching a kid that's maybe exploring using drugs and things that's messing with their lives and they're going off track, and you're like, how can I help them? And all you can do is love them and let them see the consequences of their choice lead them to a point where they say hit rock bottom, or wake them up and they start to go, crap, I got to change my life. And there's many, many stories of people that go through that with the example of drugs, that it becomes a good thing for them, that they learned a great lesson from it. But there's many others that it destroys them and even causes them to pass away. So there's a real risk in intervening, and the Confederation definitely holds themselves to that level of got to allow it to play out. But boy, we're eager to help if they'll let us.
There's a question in the chat. So if there were to be a group of people meditating, asking for intervention or assistance, what percentage or numbers of people would be required for that? Has Ra talked about that at all?
No, he does, and he talks about the law of squares, and it's really enough people that have, when combined with the law of squares, that the number calling overpowers the negative call for the opposite. Now, the negative call for the opposite is not a coherent call, but there's millions of people that are walking around very confused, and their calling is very self-centered, often survival, even mundane things. So they're very not really calling about things that are very trivial or selfish. And the Orion group are very good at manipulating that. And so because we don't know the numbers and percentages, it doesn't make sense to sort of put out a number saying if you have this much people, you'll get an answer. I think the truth is, if you yourself have a desire for service to others and are calling for information that would help you be a better healer, heal yourself, be a better teacher, be more open to how you can serve others, balancing energies, whatever it is that you feel your calling is, that your higher self will surely enable that would be answered. Your higher self is your first responder, okay? Because they want you to succeed just as powerfully as you want to succeed, probably more so because they see the bigger picture from a much bigger point of view than we do in our veiled state. And so there's no answer to what's the number, but the more the number, the greater the squaring effect is, right? 3 squared is 9, not 9 squared, right? See how it, so if you've got 3 people, it's like 9 people. I hope I'm getting the math right. 9 squared is what? I don't know. Someone do the math on that. Isn't it 80 something or
9 nines.
Yeah, 9 is 9 nines the same as 9 squared?
So
Okay. So 9 nines are 81, is that right? So that would be, if you got 9 people, that's like 81 people. Got 3 people, that's like 9 people. So you see, as the small number gets just small, a little bit bigger, it actually maximizes the calling effect. by manyfold. So it gets to a point where once you've got over 50 to 100 people, you're having it's a calling of thousands that the Confederation responds to. So you open a lot. And all that's got to do is counteract the negative call, balance out the negative call, because the positive call, what is the human? See, they see the human family as one being. Think about it that way. They look at us as a social memory complex. It's just very confused. It's kind of a schizophrenic, like a schizophrenic person. Half of it wants to do one thing, half of it wants to do another. The rest of it doesn't know what the hell it wants. So if enough of the personality of a schizophrenic person wants to do a good thing, then it can go in that direction. But if there's so much confusion in this human family that there's not enough to kind of get any direction, then there's no calling. It's just confusion.
Right. So majority wins.
In a sense, it doesn't have to be a 50% majority, though. It's a majority using the law of squares. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think you've just answered my question insofar as I don't have to seek out other like-minded people before as a group we can affect whatever the positive change is. I can actually do this myself by following the philosophies and the understandings from the life and teachings of the Masters of the Far East. I can actually do this ascension myself to then apply whatever healing or teaching, whatever my belief structure is, to change the negative side of the society that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way to put it. They're not requiring everybody to join one kind of religious dogma or indoctrination and think and believe the same thing. The difference is this: you're either wanting to be of service to others, or you're wanting to gain something for yourself. That's really the callings. It's either one or the other. So if your desire is to acquire abilities, healing, whatever, for the purpose of being of service to others, you're calling on the light side. If your desires are self-centered, then you're adding to the calling on the dark side. It's probably the easiest. And there's so many ways and so many groupings of people with different philosophies that are on the light side. They want to be of service to others in some form or another, right? Just as there is a plethora of ways that you can be of service to yourself. None of them are necessarily aware of each other, or very few of them, or united, but they're having an effect by the energy that they're calling towards. The dark wanting me, or the light wanting, how can I help? How can we make this better? How can we, what can I do? How can I add something of value to the community of life on Earth? Being in service and love and light. Yeah. So yeah, you don't have to learn or get people together and teach them this is the law of one and you have to obey this. But Ra never demands that or even asks. In fact, he discourages creating a religious kind of sectarian following, because that's never worked. It's never worked. Every time that's happened, it's turned corrupt. So that's not a good move. It looks like a good move at first, but it turns rotten real quick. And our history is great evidence of that. Okay, so let's move on with learning a little bit more about what happened with Atlantis. Was this first calling then at the time before Atlantis become technologically advanced? And Ra says, yeah, that's basically right. So they weren't high tech yet, and that's when they first started to want to align. Enough of them wanted to align with the law of one. Not all of them, but enough of them. Then did the technology advancement of Atlantis come because of this call? I'm assuming the call was answered to bring them the law of one and the law of love as a distortion of the law of one. Interesting, he says it like that, because that's actually Ra says later on that there's really only one law. It's the law of one. Everything else is a distortion. Distortion doesn't mean bad. It just means kind of a coloring in a sense of the law of one. But did they also then get technological information that caused them to grow in such a high technological society? And Ra says, no, not at first. At about the same time as we first appeared in the skies over Egypt and continuing thereafter, other entities of the Confederation appeared unto the Atlanteans, who had reached a level of philosophical understanding. Shall we misuse this word? Which was consonant with communication, to encourage and inspire study in the mystery of unity. So their calling was around wanting to understand unity, oneness, essentially law of one. However, requests being made for healing and other understandings, information was passed having to do with crystals and the building of pyramids, as well as temples, as you would call them, which were associated with training. So their pyramids were designed in Atlantis as kind of like training or educational places, more than maybe what happened in Egypt and South America. So this is kind of some information about what they were wanting and how that progressed. Okay, so other groups from the Confederation appeared to the Atlanteans, started teaching them these things. They wanted to know about healing. They gave them information on crystals and certain buildings, certain structures, pyramids and temples, etc. Okay. Then let's look at what they did with that. Was this training the same type of initiatory training that was done with the Egyptians? This training was different in that the social complex was more, shall we say, sophisticated. So the group that was calling upon the social complex of the Atlanteans was more sophisticated than the Egyptian and less contradictory and barbarous in its ways of thinking. So the Atlanteans, even though they lived older, they were further back in time than the Egyptians, seemed to be more civilized in a sense, less barbarous in their ways of thinking. Therefore, the temples were temples of learning rather than the attempts being made to totally separate and put upon a pedestal the healers. That's what happened with the Egyptians. They put the people in the temple on pedestals. They became the elitists. And that's when it started to go into an Orion group approach, whereas the Atlanteans didn't do that. They used them more like a learning center. Instead of putting people up on pedestals, it really came to learn and grow together. Don then asks, then were there what we would call priests trained in these temples? Ra says, you would not call them priests in the sense of celibacy or obedience and of poverty. They were priests in the sense of those devoted to learning. So interesting. It was almost more of a university setting in a sense. The difficulty became apparent as those trained in these learnings began to attempt to use crystal powers for those things other than healing, as they were involved not only with learning, but became involved with what you would call the governmental structure. There you go. Human nature repeating itself throughout the eons. So those who gain knowledge about how to use crystals figured out how to use them, essentially we learned later, as weapons, and became involved in government. So they became an authority over others. And there's how the corruption set in Atlantis. That's the beginning of where Atlantis became, started to get corrupted, or at least part of it did. Questions about that? Okay, so then what happened? Again, sequentially, so section with a lot of the Senate. Was all of their information, the question is, was all of their information given to them in the way you're giving our information now, in other words, through channeling, through an instrument such as this? There were visitations from time to time, but none of importance in the, shall we say, historical passage of events in your space-time continuum. So basically, yes, they did visit, there were visitations of different ways, but nothing of great noteworthy. So he says, what conditions were necessary for the visitations to occur? So Don was very interested in this because remember, Don and Kyla and the group actually started by wanting to be able to experience direct contact with ETs. And that's how all this evolved. So it makes sense that he will go to wanting to question that. So Ra's saying this happened, and he's like, well, okay, how did they do that? Tongue in cheek, he's probably thinking, can we replicate that and have a visitation ourselves? But it didn't eventuate into that. Ra answers, the conditions were two. So these were the conditions necessary for visitation. The calling of a group of people whose square, so here's where he talks about the law of squares, whose square overcome the integrated resistance of those unwilling to search or learn. So there's the balance. See, that's how he's saying the square of the number of people that were calling had to be greater than the integrated resistance of those unwilling to learn or search. That's the first requirement. The second requirement, the relative naivety of those members of the Confederation who felt that direct transfer of information would necessarily be as helpful for Atlanteans as it had been for the Confederation entity. And what he's talking about there is what happened to them. When Ra was a third density being several billion years ago on Venus, they had visitations from their higher guardians. And they were taught about pyramids and were given very much the similar things that Ra and them were giving the humans both in Atlantis and in Egypt. It worked well for them and helped their society ascend. So their naivety was, they thought, well, it helped us, it worked for us, let's give it to them, it'll help them. Turned out that it didn't. And that's what he's talking about, the members of the Confederation who had enough naivety to think that just because it worked for one group on one planet, it'll work for every planet. That was their learning. That was one of their great learnings in when not to intervene and how to be more cautious about that. So that's what he's referring to there. Don then asks, I see then, what you're saying is these naive Confederation entities had the same thing happen to them in the past, so they were doing the same thing for the Atlantean entities. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. So I just sort of paraphrased that. We remind you that we, Ra, are one of the naive members of the Confederation and are still attempting to recoup the damage for which we feel responsible. There's the karmic kind of anchor that humanity's become to Ra and the Confederation entities who were involved in intervening earlier on in our history. And so they feel and are, in a karmic sense, linked to us and want to undo the damage, right? That's also why they channeled it in the 1980s to help with the coming together of peoples for the ascension. They saw that it was an opportunity where they could, again, without overdoing it like they did with the Egyptians, channel some information that would help awaken enough wanderers and bring enough people into the light that there would be enough resonance to overcome the negatives and create a tipping point to bring humanity up into ascension. That's their hope, and that's what we're in the middle of right now. So it's tying back what's going on right now and the Law of One books and information, etc., and the flowing of information through other channelings like Cryon, Divine Mother, etc. Lots of good information coming through from the Confederation entities. He's putting it into context historically here of why that's happening. He goes on, it is our duty as well as honor to continue with your peoples, therefore, until all traces of the distortions of our teaching learnings have been embraced by their opposite distortions and balance achieved. So the distortions that the Orion group used to take the Law of One teachings and corrupt them, they need to undo that and help people see the opposite of that, the right way of using that information is kind of how I read that. And they are committed to staying with us until that happens, which will likely be right through the full ascension. So that's a little more about how we are tied to what happened in Atlantis, Egypt, the historical link of all the peoples of Earth. Many of us are the same peoples that were there, because the reincarnation just keeps going, right? You don't just get one shot at this. And so many of us are bringing that spiritual genetic, if you like, history with us from past lives. Okay. Any questions real quick?
This one question in the chat. Yeah, but was there AI during those times like we have now?
Well, let's look at this next section. This next section starts talking about something close to that.
Okay.
So hold on to that question and we'll look in the next couple of slides. We'll get to that. And then feel free to ask it again if I don't address it as clearly as you'd like. Our land is divided. So then what happened? Then I will state, Dawn is asking, I see. Then I will state the picture of how I have now of Atlantis, and you can tell me if I'm correct. So this is what Dawn's saying, how I see what happened. And then Rob does say this is correct with one exception. So basically what he's saying here is all correct. And the one exception is that he talks about the law of, it talks about a different, Rob's objecting to the use of law meaning other than the law of one. Other than that, everything he says is right. So let's look at how he paints the picture. So Don is saying, summing up, we have a condition where a large enough number of the entities of Atlantis had started at least going in the direction of the law of one and living the law of one, for their call to be heard by the Confederation. So yes, that's what happened. This call was heard because using the law of squares, that's what Ra objects to. He doesn't call it the law of squares, and he wants to be very accurate with his language. So there's not really a law called the law of squares. It's a concept of principle. But using the law of squares, it overrode the opposition of the Atlantean entities that were not calling. So there you go. There's that balancing thing. The Confederation then used channels such as we use now for communication and also made contact directly. But this turned out to be a mistake because it was prevented by some of the entities. It was perverted, sorry, by some of the entities of Atlantis. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. The one exception. There is only one law, and that's the law of one. Other so-called laws are distortions of that law. Some of them primal and most important for progress to be understood. However, it is well that each so-called law, which we also call way, be understood as a distortion rather than a law. There is no multiplicity to the law of one. So Ra goes on a bit of a rant there about the use of the word law, which obviously is a sore point for him. But that's, other than that, this is his painting of the picture of what's going on at Atlantis was quite accurate. Then Don says, could you give me the average lifespan of the Atlantean population? Right. I said the average lifespan, as we have said, is misleading. The Atlanteans were, in the early part of their cultural experience, used to lifespans from 70 to 140 years. This being, of course, approximate. Due to increasing desire for power, the lifetime decreased rapidly in the later stages of their civilization, and thus the healing, rejuvenating information was required. So the distortion towards power over others, I would add, reduces lifespan. Interesting way to frame lifespans today. Although theirs weren't too different than ours today, although there's not a lot of people that make it to 140, but you get about 110 or 12 is about the top end right now, but they had a fairly similar lifespan, a little bit longer than ours, but that got reduced because of the distortion towards power. Interesting framing of that. So questions quickly about that. There was, so obviously there was a division. There were some Atlanteans that were very interested in the law of one, enough that overcome the others who weren't interested in it. And that's the balancing thing in the law of squares going on there.
So the information that quotes 1% of the square root of the population that requires correction is not true. E.g., 1,000 politicians to be corrected would equal square root of 1,000 equals 32 times 1% of that is 0.3 person to make the change. 32 is the correct number of people? Question?
You're asking me to do math, and it's never something I like. There's probably people that are better at working out the numbers. The one thing that Ra does say, though, is that you can't always add it up as exactness mathematically, because some people's calling, whether it's on the negative or the positive, might not be 100%. So their contribution isn't counted as a full one. It might be a 0.9 or 0.8. Does that make sense? You don't know that. We can't tell that. So that there's going to be some fudging in there. So it's really hard to come up with exactness in the numbers like that because of our veiled condition. We don't know.
Yep.
It's about the best answer I can give on that one.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. So then what happened? Atlantis went nuclear. So here's where we start to get to the end game in Atlantis. And we're almost at the end of the presentation. So in the last session, you mentioned, this is going on session 24, you mentioned that during the last 25,000 year cycle, the Atlanteans, Egyptians, and those in South America were contacted, and then the Confederation departed. Basically what we've just gone through. I understand the Confederation did not come back for some time. Could you tell me the reason, the consequences, the attitudes with respect to the next contact with those here on planet Earth? In the case of the Atlanteans, enlargements upon the information given resulted in those activities distorted towards bellicosity, which is warfare, anger, discord, which resulted in the final second Atlantean catastrophe at about 10,821 of your years in the past, as you measure time. So there were two great Atlantean catastrophes, one right at the turn of the 25,000 years, and then a second one a little bit later. This is likely the flood of Noah story here. Many were displaced due to the societal actions both upon Atlantis and upon those areas that you would call North Africa, deserts, to which some Atlanteans had gone after the first conflict. So after the first great problem, and so there's two major conflicts separated by quite a few hundred years, a bunch of Atlanteans sort of left Atlantis, if you like, and went off into the world, some to North Africa, some all over the place. Each changes continued due to these, what you would call nuclear bombs and other crystal weapons, sinking the last great landmass approximately 9,600 of your years ago. So there was a nuclear war with the Atlanteans. They had crystal weapons. So they took the crystal technology that Ra gave them for healing and learned how to weaponize it. Isn't that interesting? Their military was just like the military in the West today. They look at every technological advancement and say, how can we blow shit up with that? And that's what these guys did. So they had nuclear bombs, they went nuclear, and they had crystal weapons, which, and all accounts, in some ways, were even worse. We don't have those yet, but apparently they did some severe damage to the planet, and it caused the sinking of their landmass about 9,600 years ago. Okay. So in the Egyptian and the South American experiments, so again, he calls them experiments. Again, these groups get sort of sequestered off by geography, and then they kind of work with them in their individual groups because it's not a unified world yet. Most of the population of the world didn't have much awareness of where everybody else was. Some did, but not a lot. Certainly the Atlanteans were much more technologically advanced. Probably they had nuclear bombs and crystal weapons. They probably had flight as well, and who knows what else. So this was not in some sense, they were probably more advanced in their technology than we are currently. That's my sense of it anyway. At least equal, probably even further and more advanced than we were. In the Egyptian and South American experiments, in the Egyptian and the South American experiments, results, though not as widely devastating, were as far from the original intention of the Confederation. So even in those off groups that weren't connected to Atlantis directly, didn't come out the way the Confederation wanted it. It was clear to not only us, but also the Council and the Guardians. Council of Saturn and the Guardians is a council of 24 that the Council of Saturn uses as advisors. That our methods were not appropriate for this particular sphere. In other words, what happened with Atlantis made them think doing what we've been trying to do is not working for these humans on Earth. These damn humans that keep taking what we're giving them and turning it into bad stuff, right? It's not working. So they sat back and said, we need to rethink this. So then he goes, our attitude thus was one of caution, observation, and continuing attempts to creatively discover methods whereby contact from our entities could be of service with the least distortion and above all with the least possibility of becoming perversions or antithesis of our intention in sharing information. So they then sat back and said, how can we help these people without them being able to corrupt what we're giving them in a way that just backfires right in our face, like it has with Atlantis and these other groups. Okay, so there's a significant change in the attitude of the Confederation on their willingness to come down and intervene and help us. And not only their willingness was always there, but the way they looked at how the best to do it. They tried a couple of things, including appearing to us, channeling real clear information, but each time, over time, it became corrupted and used in a bad way, which caused us to become a karmic anchor to them because they gave us the information. They were doing it with intention to serve, but it was turned against them. The Orion Group's influence is very powerful throughout this. They don't look at the Orion Group or blame them, but the Orion Group's influence is very much involved here in countering what they gave. Whenever they gave something of the light, the Orion Group gave them corrupt stuff to help them use what the new information was that the Confederation gave in a bad way. And there's the influence there of the war of dark and light, of good and evil, if you like. So Atlantis went nuclear. So the last slide sums up the whole thing. And then let's just sort of look at that and then we'll ask questions if they come up. So the Atlantean race was very conglomerate, diverse, in other words. Social complex which began to form approximately 31,000 years in your past. So that's in the second major cycle, wasn't it? Right? That's in the second major cycle is when Atlantis started to come together. That's when they had come on the planet in your space-time continuum illusion. It was a slow-growing and very agrarian or farming type of society until approximately 15,000 of years ago. Look at how long it lasted. Over 15,000 years, Atlantis was on the Earth. Through a major catastrophe transition at the 25,000 years change, but it lasted a hell of a long time, had a great influence. Just look at the dates there. Started 31,000 and lasted until 15,000 of years ago. At 15,000 years ago, it reached quickly a high technological understanding, which caused it to be able to use intelligent infinity in a less informative manner. So they developed the technology which enabled them to use energy weapons and things in a way that wasn't helpful. We may add that they used intelligent energy as well, manipulating greatly the natural influx of the indigo and pineal ray from divine or infinite energy. So they learn how to use that energy, and that's a lot of what the pyramids is about. It's about that energy, that's the spiritual energy that a lot of our Western society is very ignorant about, right? That was their main energy kind of technology. So then thus they were able to create life forms. So there's a reference to what could be AI or genetic manipulation or both. Right? Now, this is very interesting. They were able to do that to a level that they were able to create life forms. This they began to do instead of healing and perfecting their own mind, body, spirit complexes, turning their distortions towards what you would call the negative. So there's a lot there about what happened and how they used their technology and how it corrupted them. Right? Very, very lot to ponder in that. Approximately 11,000 of you years ago, the first of the you call wars. So this is again still Atlantis. So it's been going 15,000 years, and then another 2,000 years past that, or even more, another 4,000 years past that. The first of what you call wars caused approximately 40% of the population of Atlantis to leave. Look at how they say it, to leave the density by means of disintegration of the body. Holy crap. What kind of weapons did they have? That nuclear would do that. Look at that. They decimated 40% of their population with weapons that disintegrated them. The second and most devastating of the conflicts occurred approximately 10,000, so almost 200 years after they disintegrated 40% of their population. They had another war. And according to your illusion, this created an earth-changing configuration, and the large part of Atlantis was no more. So they destroyed themselves. They basically did to their community what had happened in Maldek. And that's why it started with Maldek, because Maldek and Atlantis were compared in the beginning as developing kind of very similar technologies and societies. And they ended up the same way, except the Atlanteans didn't quite blow the whole planet up, luckily, but they certainly developed technology that probably could have. This created an earth-changing configuration, and the large part of Atlantis was no more, having been inundated. So there's the flood. 3 of the positively orientated of the Atlantean groups left this geographical location before that devastation, placing themselves in the mountain areas of what you would call Tibet, what you would call Peru, and what you would call Turkey. So interesting. So the ones that were good enough and wise enough to get out before they vaporized themselves ended up seeding Tibet, Peru, and Turkey. So there's, in a nutshell, what the hell happened in Atlantis. There's, in a nutshell, the timeline. They lived as a society for a very, very long time, longer than any society in our dispensation has, right? Much, much longer. You know, almost 20,000 years, 15,000 to 20,000 years, they existed as a society and developed great technologies that ended up, though, because of their lack of enough of them spiritually growing in the community, they caused themselves to get flooded out, caused a great change on the planet that caused the great flood. So there's a raw perspective on the Atlantis, Lemuria, and the 3 historically relatively unknown but often spoken about societies. Can you unshare me? Thank you. Thanks, Lou. So we can see each other and see what other questions we have. Hopefully that was interesting. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it leaves a lot more unanswered. But this does tell you what Russ is about what happened, and there's some quite detailed information in there, especially around what they were focused on and how they were helped or not helped by the Confederation intervening. So any comments or questions that you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Scott. That was great. Really, really good. Question. On the third cycle, 25,000 years, which we are at the moment, to close the 75,000 years, I remember once you roughly approximate the time to our actual timeline at the moment. Are we, if I'm not mistaken, I think that you refer to within this harvest will occur within the next 20 years or so. That is the number I'm trying to locate at the moment.
Yeah.
For this next harvesting.
We often talk about the harvest because we are thinking there's going to be a great ascension event where there's a big flash and everybody instantly changes into fourth density. I'm not saying that won't happen, but that's not how Ra talks about the harvest. In fact, Ra talks about the harvest as already happening. We're in the middle of it. In other words, the harvesters are out there picking the grain right now. And the way they do it is when we die right now, you don't go through the normal routine in between lives that you would have done normally when there's not a harvest on. Because there's a harvest on, you go before a specific kind of a board where you assess your own light levels against sort of a backdrop of what are the optional light levels, kind of like climbing a stairway is the metaphor Ra uses. And if you're at the light level that is at 5D or fourth density, then you're harvestable into that. Then you will be reincarnated into a fourth density body in your next cycle. You won't come back as a 3D person. That's happening right now and has been happening since I believe it started in the 1930 odd is when Ra said it started happening. So we're already in the harvest, and that can go on. He said up to 700 years it can take. Depends on how people process through and finish out this cycle. See, they don't look at time like we do, and the harvest time right now is happening. So we're not waiting for it to happen. We're in it. So when you die as a normal part of life, which is still going on all around us, you go towards basically the final judgment and assist. And if you haven't got enough credits to graduate, you get reassigned to come back to another university on another planet. Is basically how it works. You could come back to here for another cycle because there's enough time before enough people graduate that the Earth goes into 5D. Once the planet itself goes into 5D, which is what often we talk about when we say the harvest, then it will no longer support 3D. And that's a significant event because then there's no more veiled third density people on Earth. They'll be all removed. That is the finalization of the planet's ascension into the next level. And then everybody that comes down on Earth then is at 5D, if we want to use that terminology, or as Ra calls it, the fourth density. But until then, there's going to be both groups here, and there are right now. There's 4 or 5D or fourth density people now, and there's third density people now, and so there's a kind of a conglomerate mix of it. So we're in the middle of the harvest. Is really the short answer to that question. It's not about when will it happen. It is already occurring all around it. Yeah.
So it depends.
And there's another caveat to that. You can get close enough with your higher self to know if you've passed the bar. Just like at university, you don't have to wait until you go up on the stage to see if they'll hand you the diploma or not, or say, no, you didn't make it. You know before you go up that you've got your diploma, and you can know before you die that you've made it. And if you don't know that, that's a great thing to ask, but you got to ask. and it's not an unreasonable thing to want to know. If you're in university and you're getting close to your graduation, if you're smart, and most people are, if they're in university, they're going to say, what other classes do I need to take to graduate? Can I cram them into this final semester? Right? If I take all the classes that I've got this semester and pass them, I'm going to graduate. You can know that, and you should know that. It's not something that needs to be kept secret from you. So there's a good thing to pursue in a negotiation with your higher self to say, where am I at with regards to that? Shouldn't be a surprise to you. Doesn't have to be. You can know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, it depends. It depends on the planet. The planet, it's the only limitation, really.
The planet is only limited by us. The planet is holding off, and we know we're on an alternate time zone, so it's already been extended a little bit. The planet is patiently holding off. Raz says the planet is already at 4D spiritually. So in the time-space dimension, it's already transitioned. Just in the space-time dimension, which is final dimension here on Earth that we experience, it's holding off to wait for enough of us to get by. It doesn't want to shake us off before enough of us have had a chance. There's enough of us close enough that it's willing to kind of hold on to the birthing process, even though it's painful for it, for a few more days, for a few more years, maybe. But it's getting real close to where it's just going to say, look, it's time to let go of all third density and move to the next level. And that's coming up real close. So I would think that there's going to be very significant events in the next 10 years that will start to really wake enough people up and be very indicative of the kind of things we've been hearing about at the end of a cycle. Because we're past, I think, the literal timeline of the 75,000 years. We're on 75,000 years plus a little bit now. We're sort of creeping into, so it's like a woman giving birth. She goes in on a Wednesday and late at night, but it's Thursday and she's still in labor, right? And it's a long, hard labor. And that's a little bit of what's going on with Mother Earth. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thanks, Lou.
The latest point, the question I will ask later. So as you mentioned, Scott, that when it will be harvested, there will be no third density. They won't help, or it will be wiped away, right?
When the Earth fully transitions, third density, there's a period when third density can't live on the Earth. You have to be at a fourth density. So there's a period of time when yes, they will people who are third density will be put on another planet, and that's been made clear. Just like a lot of people were put here because they didn't graduate their planet.
So that will be a window period.
Pardon?
Will that be like a window period before the new harvest, before the new cycle starts, or has it been happening always at every harvest? That there's a period when they are moved to another planet or wherever, and then there's a window period, and then the cycle starts again. Is it
on other planets?
Wherever, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, the harvest that happened on the first 25,000 years didn't happen here. There was nobody. Second 25,000 years, there was only a small group, and so there was. Those were intermediate harvests. Those are the early graduates of the family. The final harvest at 75,000 years is where the planet is completed its third density mission, and it is going up. So anybody that stays on Earth will have to go up with it or get transplanted to another planet. And that's always the way it's been throughout the eternities. Because the Earth now moves on in its own spiritual advancement, becomes a fourth, and then probably a fifth, and then probably a sixth density planet in billions of years. Who knows how long, because time is really only part of our illusion, but the Earth is progressing just like we are. And so right now we're holding her back because we're dicking around at college and not studying hard enough, or enough of us aren't. Right now, enough of us are starting to come on that it's starting to make a significant difference. So all signs are very encouraging Yeah, that what we're doing is helping. What others like our group are doing is helping, and the Earth is starting to shift in the right direction. There's still a lot of people who are messing about and just playing around at college instead of studying, but enough people are graduating or getting to the point where they can graduate. Ra still indicates that the harvest is going to be few. That they said that. I think in a way to try and motivate us to get our act together. Part of me thinks that that's worked quite well, and that in the last 40 years since Ra gave the channeling, there's been quite a spiritual awakening that's been fairly impressive. And if we continue on that lines, we're doing quite well. Enough that the Earth shifts. We've already been told that the Earth shifts that originally were prophesized don't need to happen anymore. There was going to be a significant pole shift that would have created a lot of tidal problems, a lot of inundation again with great masses of waves. Apparently, that no longer needs to happen because enough people have offset the negative. So we continue on with that offsetting with enough positive people looking to be in service to others. We're not looking too bad. We just got to keep going. It's not time to back off. We've got to really start pushing firmly, because we get over that threshold, then the Earth will fully shift, and then the Earth will become a new world. It will become absolutely a new world. Now, there'll be some transition times. So again, the myth that everything happens overnight and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and it's all fourth density and everybody's love and light and everybody knows. I don't think that's realistic. It doesn't sound like that's really the way it happens ever. There's a lot more of a bit of a transition period of kind of learning the new ways of living, rather than it instantly becoming, on you. There's a missed opportunity if it happens instantly, because the learning process of adapting from the old ways to the better new ways, I think is also educational and quite developmentally beneficial to us. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank
Fee?
you.
Hi there. Thank you for the information that you shared tonight. It's been really interesting to hear that. I just have some curiosity around what you've just mentioned and what role AI is playing in this in regards to what has been injected into people's body as a AI nanotech that is in the human form, and how it's acting out on the planet now. Like, how much effect does that have on the transcending to different dimensions?
Well, it would only be my opinion, but I would always advise people to be very cautious about letting them inject anything into you these days, given what we know. I'd be very skeptical about that. And if you've had to have that, I would look into remedies that can help try and help flush some of that out. I don't trust the government of the world. I think they're very much a part of the big picture agenda to align with the Orion Group's agenda of dominance. And they're losing control and they're losing power, but they've still got it, and they're still able to inflict a great deal of harm on people. So I think the wise thing would be to avoid being involved with that, and don't let them trick you into doing it again. They'll come up with another reason. There'll be another pandemic or they'll come up with something, and it won't be too long before we hear it. But I think the world woke up from the first one enough that I don't think they're going to fall for it again. So it's going to be a lot harder for them, because they screwed up their original agenda. And there's much better information than I have on this that you can look at. That the original agenda was clearly trying to depopulate the earth enough that they can control the mass psychology of people into slavery and manipulate them into that, which is absolutely an Orion Group thing. Whether you take the nanotechnology into your body and it has an effect on other dimensions, my instinct is only if you want it to. I think the free choice comes in, and once you are aware of what you've done, if you want to choose to continue on that line, then they're going to allow you to do that. And people get that choice. That's how the Orion group continues to populate their peoples. But once you realize what it is, then you say, no, I don't want that. Follow me. I think that you'll have the option to clear that off you. But it does have an influence while you're here in mortality and veil. And it can block your ability to link up and pierce the veil, and who knows what other things it can do to you physically. Others on the group might have more information than that. I would avoid it though. That would be the safe thing.
Yeah, that's not an issue for me. I'm wondering, because the nanotechnology is AI and it's self-replicating within the human form, and also the amount of AI that is now being involved in governments and in everyday life that's happening. I was wondering how that may influence or interfere with the ascension of the soul and the planet.
I think you're safe to bet on that the universe is designed to support you in your spiritual evolution, and you can have faith in that. And you can call upon your guides and guardians to help protect you from that. And so the influences in that cannot be forced upon you unwillingly, unless for some reason you've chosen into that. So if you can absolutely negotiate in conversation with your guides, protection against that, that is exactly what their job is to help you with. And so you open the door to their intervention. You can't be tricked into going on the dark side or being enslaved permanently with them, because that's not the way the Confederation is designed to protect you from that very thing. And they're still in charge and will always be in charge. This earth is theirs. It's not going to fall to the Orion group. The Orion group is really already lost. We're just seeing the last throes of their tantrum, if you like, but they've already lost. And so, yeah, call upon your spiritual guides and your spiritual powers to protect you and surround you in protection from them. Because those influences are there, but they can't be forced upon you or tricked into you. And there's some way you allow that, or are naive enough to kind of go along and not realize what you're getting into. But even if that happens, once you wake up enough to say, hey, I want out of that, I don't want that, your guardians and your guides will give you the direction you need to clean that out and to change course. You're at
But
the
if
end
these
of the cycle,
people,
so they're not going to let you graduate into the wrong group unless you've chosen it.
yeah, so I'm thinking about family members and friends. And so some of them are just not spiritually aware at all. And that technology is within them. And, that affects their brains and, their cognitive thinking. And, it interferes with your gifts and intuitions and all that sort of thing that some of us came here with already intact. So how are they going to get the opportunity to become aware of this stuff when that's in them and they're not aware?
Yeah, it might be that they need another cycle, that they're not ready yet. You got to trust that their guardians are helping them the best they can. All we can do and you can do is be the best you, is to be your vibrant spiritual self and to allow them to live their lives by their choice and support them in their choice, even if you don't agree with it. But you being your best self is bringing light into their life just by your own resonance that might cause them to go, B's got something that I'd like. I don't know what it is. Maybe I'll ask, or maybe I want to change my life. But that's got to be up to them. So all you can do is be who you are and allow them to be who they are.
Right. So the AI is not affecting the ascension of Earth.
No, there's nothing the Orion group can do to stop that. It's part of the divine concept that when a planet gets to a certain point, it will go through this transition. Where you fall out on it is going to be a conglomerate of your life choices or lives choices. You've taken many semesters of classes many times through to get to graduation. What they're doing, and they don't fall into the fear mongering of, oh, the AI is coming and we're going to get blocked and we're going to end up. No, that's Orion Group fear. Fear is always the Orion Group's tool. Anything that makes you feel like, uh-oh, I'm going to be tricked here. I'm afraid of making the choice. Just center yourself and trust your guides and have that relationship with them, and just center yourself and be in that spiritual guidance thing. Learn to penetrate the veil and then trust that you'll be guided in those moments. So that really won't happen unless there's something you've chosen that has asked for that experience, and then that you need that experience. But very, very doubtful that that's the case.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I wasn't asking for myself, I was asking for others, but it's great to have that information. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I have family members in the same boat, so I understand your dilemma.
You sort of answered what I was going to ask about AI on the Orion Group. So you think that is possibly that energy is part of one and the other.
Yeah, I think that there can be a good aspect to AI, and I think that the light side can use a form of AI to be very informative and helpful. It's a tool. Any tool can be good or bad. Just like Ra gave the Atlanteans knowledge about crystals that was very powerful for healing. That was a good tool. But then they figured out, hey, we can blow people up with this or vaporize them. So they used it in a way that wasn't intended. I look at AI as the same type of thing. It's a tool that, when used right, can be very powerful and beneficial. When used wrong, can be very powerful and harmful. It's not the tool, right? A hammer can be a great tool, but it could be a awful weapon. Anything can be used in a positive or a negative way, and to me, that's my view on what AI is. It's the morality of the user, not the tool itself.
Now, we've talked about Maldek and Atlantis. There's also Mars as part of that destruction as well. Does Ra go into the Mars part? The Mars.
Yeah, I'll do another presentation on that. There's a lot of involvement with Mars in us. In fact, just a teaser, one of the reasons we look like the way we do is because we have Mars DNA, and Ra talks about that. That's why we look quite a bit different from the second density creatures that were designed to build up to a third density, basically apes, right? We're part of the ape family, but we're quite different than them. Ra says in most planets, when they evolve from second to third density beings look quite similar to the second density beings that they evolved from. We, however, do not. The reason we don't is because there was an intervention with the Mars group right at around 75,000 years ago when we were evolving. That's when they blew the crap out of their planet. And so a whole bunch of them need to be quickly incarnated here. And to help with that, they pulled their DNA, their physical DNA, and entwined it into what was going on here. That become another curveball, if you like, another interesting uniqueness of the Earth situation. So yeah, Ra does talk a lot about some of the things that happened with Mars and the involvement of them into integrating them into us as a part of the human family. Yeah.
A lot of artifacts on Mars that are similar to the Egyptian architecture.
Yeah,
or
that
the
wouldn't
old.
surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
There clearly
Okay,
was a
thank you,
thriving
Scott.
civilization on Mars. Yeah, and I think the space people are keeping that from us, but there clearly was an absolute, master now to keeping that from us, from the major population. Yeah, it'll come out sooner or later. There was a thriving community on Mars, and there'll be a lot of artifacts, I'm sure, left over, because it wasn't really that long ago. 75,000 years is a long time, but
No, and we've been held that information, and we've been going to Mars for 20 years anyway.
Yeah,
if not more. Thank you for your
Yeah,
presentation.
You're welcome. Yeah, my pleasure.